I had a professor in college whose name was Dr. Jerry Root. And something, because I think I took maybe 3 classes with him whenever I was at Wheaton, and something he said all the time in his classes, like this theme would kind of keep coming up in almost anything we talked about. And the thing that he would constantly say was this, and I wrote it down to make sure I got it right. He said, in life, we can have a sure word, but never a final word. In life, we can have a sure word, but not a final word. And the saying, it was meant to humble us, to show us that no matter how much we think we understand a subject, there's always more to learn. No matter how well how precise or how clearly we think we can explain something, there are greater depths to be mined of the truth of any subject. Like, we can have a sure word about something, we can say something true about a particular topic, but we never get a final word. We never get to say, like, here, what I just said right here, that's all there is on that topic, and there's no possible other way or better way to talk about that thing. And so this is important for us to realize as we're jumping into this new series that we're doing called Questions. And what we're going to be doing over the next few weeks is looking at kind of these key burning questions that have either been asked throughout, centuries or millennia among human civilization, kind of these long-going questions that no matter how many sure words we get about it, it never seems like we quite arrive. We're going to be looking at some of those. We're going to be looking at certain ones that are more burning questions of our time now, that are burning questions of this culture. And the week that I'm most excited about this series is final week of the series. We're actually going to do kind of like a discussion panel where myself and Van and Darren will actually be up here. And what we're going to do is during the whole series, you're going to have opportunities to submit questions, things you've wondered, questions you've always had about God or the spiritual life or, things like that. And we're going to do our best to kind of talk through some of those things. In fact, even today, you can begin to submit those questions. You may have noticed the giant red box out in the lobby. That is actually a place where you can submit questions. There's little pieces of paper you can write stuff down and put them in there. You can actually go online if you're more of a techie person. If you go to newhopepoll.com, you can actually submit your questions on there. And you'll be able to do that over the next 3 weeks. And then the last week of the series, we will begin to unpack some of those. And there'll be a little interactive part of the service to be able to kind of play a part in what questions we answer and in what order and stuff like that. So really, really excited about that. But back to what I was talking about before, something that I've been praying about for this message and just really been hoping from God is my desire for the topic I'm going to cover today is that I would have a sure word about it. Like, I'm not under any illusion that what I'm going to say around this topic is going to be a final word where it's like after that 30-minute message, well, that's an airtight argument and no one's ever going to have any more questions. No one's ever going to ask anything or discuss any more around it. In fact, if anything, it'll be the exact opposite. I hope that it actually breeds conversation, breeds questions, that it causes you to look deeper into these things and hopefully broadens your understanding of who God is in his truth. So I want to start with this. A couple years ago, there was a woman who came up to me after one of the services and had asked for prayer. Like we have the prayer time up here, and she came up and asked for prayer. And so I usually will ask her, like, hey, what's going on? How can I pray for you? And I get a little information before I pray for them. And she had said, she's like, well, my cancer's actually back. And I'm like, oh, man. She says, for the 3rd time. It's like, what? There are very few times where, like, I'm left speechless. And I didn't know what to say. The 3rd time her cancer's come back. And so I start kind of asking around that. And it turns out that that's not even why she came forward. Like, she's a great woman of faith, believed God was going to do a work in that, God was going to heal her again. And we got to pray about that and stuff like that. And God's going to heal her like he'd healed her before. And like, so that actually wasn't what she wanted to talk to me about. What she wanted to talk to me about was her neighbor. She said, I talk with my neighbor all the time. We've developed a friendship, and we talk and stuff like that. And my neighbor, she's not a Christian. And when she found out my cancer was back for a 3rd time, she said something and asked me a question that, and I'm sure you've all heard this question 1,000 times. She says, I just can't believe in a God that lets such things happen. Why do things like that happen? And so she was kind of asking me like for wisdom and how to pray about that and how to talk about that. And that's a great question. Why is there so much pain and suffering in the world? And so I've been praying and I've been thinking and I've been studying, and I'm super indebted to multiple great authors and speakers and figures, reading stuff from C.S. Lewis, listening to messages from John Ortberg, and just very, very indebted to a lot of these people and some of the ideas that are formed around here. And I was thinking about that, I think I could very easily offer pat answers around it. I could say things like, well, there's suffering and pain in the world because sin exists in the world, and death and sin and all of that, death and suffering and all that is in the world because of the existence of sin. And that is a true word. I could also talk about the evils of human choice and how terrible things exist in the world because evil and twisted people make terrible decisions that bring all kinds of misery on other people. That is also a true word. But neither of those are final words. Because even in the midst of those discussions, there's still questions. There's, questions remain and doubts linger. And in a lot of ways, those are just signposts that point down to, down the road to the final word that will one day come that we just can't seem to really get to right now. And so that's why approaching this topic, humility, is so important. And see, here's the thing that I've learned about pat answers, tidy little theological, hey, here's your answer, and that's all you need to know. The reason why I don't want to do that is because pat answers don't give comfort to a parent who's lost a child. Pat answers don't give comfort to someone who's lost everything in a fire or lost everything in an earthquake or a mudslide or had to flee their home because of persecution or war or famine or lost everything in a Ponzi scheme or something like that. Like tidy little theologies of suffering don't give much hope for those who have paid in blood and sweat and tears just to survive in this world. So instead of giving a bunch of proofs and a bunch of explanations, I want to tell you a story instead. And the story starts like this. In the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys, and had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East. So the story starts out in this place called the land of Uz. Now, nobody really knows specifically where the land of Uz was. Kind of like a Dr. Seuss book. But we do know that it was in the East. Said that he was one of the greatest men of the East. And this is important for us to know because there's imagery there with that. We know in the Bible that when sin came into the world, that Adam and Eve, when they had to leave the garden, it said that they settled in the East. And so it kind of became this imagery in the Bible that east of Eden became this picture of where life is broken, where things are not quite right. That is the land of Uz. Now, when the story starts, everything's fine. Everything's great. Job has this amazing life. Everything's wonderful. He's this pious man, kind of this poster boy for, the person who has kept the covenant and has been blessed by God because of it. God gives Job this wonderful life. And this is important to note because the beginning of this story, it gives the impression that the amount of Job's blessings is directly proportional to the amount of obedience that Job offers. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. I want you to kind of put a pin in that. Because the truth is, trouble is coming to the land of Uz. Very quickly, Uz becomes this place where very bad things happen to a very good man. Uz is the place not just where suffering comes, but it comes without warning. It comes without explanation. And it seems like God is not there. See, the truth is, every single one of us will spend time in the land of Uz. In fact, some of you may already be there right now. And that's why you're here today. Because of divorce or anxiety or depression or disappointment or death, problems with children, loss of job, financial weight, crushing guilt. And the whole time you're wondering, why is this happening to me? That is the land of Uz. Now, in verse 6 in this story, there's kind of this radical shift in scenery. The writer sets up the story of Job almost like a play is set up, where there are almost like, you almost have to imagine the theater with 2 different stages. There is a lower stage, which kind of represents everything that's going on in earth, and then there's this upper stage, which represents everything that's going on in heaven. And see, this is crucial to the story of Job, because we, the readers, the audience, we get to know what's going on both stages. But we need to remember that those on the lower stage, such as Job, they don't know. They don't get to know, they don't get to hear, they don't get to understand what is happening on the upper stage. And so verse 6, it takes us to the upper stage, and it says this: "One day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord said to Satan, 'Where have you come from?' And Satan answered the Lord, 'From roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it.' Then the Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job?'" Now listen to the way that he's described. This is not Job describing himself. This is not another human describing Job. This is God talking about Job. He says, "There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." That is how God views Job. More on that in a minute. Story goes on. "Does Job fear God for nothing?" Satan replied. "Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands so that his flocks and his herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Very well, then everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger." Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. And if you know the story, which many of us grew up hearing it, Satan goes out, Job loses everything. He loses his wealth, he loses his livestock, he loses his servants, he even loses his children. Everything. And then we see what his response is in verse 20. It says, "At this, Job got up and tore his robes and shaved his head, and then he fell to the ground in worship and said, 'Naked I have come from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised.' In all of this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing." So we're told that Job grieves. Job worships. He speaks words of blessing and praise, and in all of this, he did not sin. And this happens on the lower stage. Now, it's about to go back up to the upper stage again, but see, here's the important thing that we need to realize about this story. We read the book of Job, and we think that the central question to this book is, where is God in the midst of suffering? Am I right? Like that, we tend to, like when we think of the book of Job, we think that is the central question. What is, where is God in the midst of suffering? But that is actually not the main question that this book explores. The main question that this book explores is actually the question that Satan asks God. Does Job fear God for nothing? See, there is an assertion made by the accuser where he says that the spiritual life is just quid pro quo. That humans on earth, they love God like the Cookie Monster loves cookies, that if God were to turn off the faucet of blessing, watch how quickly Job turns off the faucet of devotion. And therefore, suffering is meaningless. And isn't that what we hear in this world? Suffering is meaningless. It has no purpose at all. So Satan is making the assertion, this whole idea that at the very center of the universe is this, undeniable covenant love. He says, covenant love is a farce, and I'll prove it. Let me take away everything he has, and he'll curse you to his face. Which, of course, he doesn't the first round, but he comes back, and there's a round two, and where he says, hey, skin for skin, anybody will give up anything they have to save their own life. Let me strike him, and he'll curse you to your face. And so God says, okay, you can do that, but you can't take his life. You can only harm him physically, take away his health. And of course, we know that comes, and of course, then we find him by the end of the second round of suffering. He's literally sitting in an ash heap, covered with sores, scraping off the sores with a broken piece of pottery. It's literally the lowest a person could possibly be. And to add insult to injury, his wife shows up on the scene and says, are you still holding on to your integrity? Why don't you just curse God and die? Now, I know we give Mrs. Job a lot of guff about that, about her saying that. We always give her a hard time. In fact, we're not the only ones. It turns out, because I was doing a little research, a little reading, and I found that there in the 4th century, there was this church father named John Chrysostom that actually in one of his commentaries around Job, he actually wrote that he believed that Job's greatest suffering was that God didn't take away Mrs. Job. And I know there may be some of you here this morning who feel the same way, but I do counseling. We can work on that later. But a word on that. Like I said, Job's wife gets a lot of guff for that, but we got to remember she lost everything too. All of her stuff, all of her possessions, her status. Mom's in the room. She lost all of her children. So you got to think the thoughts that occurred to her, they probably occurred to Job too. She just said them. She just gave voice to thoughts that probably occurred to Job and have occurred to all of us who have existed in the land of Uz. But of course, Job responds. He wants to give the righteous answer. So in Job 2:10, he says, "You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" But this is interesting because we can see in this moment there begins to be a shift. We can see that Job is starting to struggle in his heart. Because he's asking the question, is God really the type of person who sends trouble? Is God really good? And that's the question many of us ask in the midst of all these types of things. And so we see kind of after this second wave of suffering in verse 10, it says, "In all of this, Job did not sin in what he said." Now, notice the words there. It's not like the first round where it just said he just didn't sin. It says that he didn't sin in anything he said. And I think that's very specific for a reason, because I think it's starting to show that in his heart, Job is beginning to struggle. He's beginning to wonder. He's beginning to think. And then, of course, then his friends show up, and you know how the story goes. They show up, and I love the beginning of this picture when his, maybe that was his little small group. I don't know who they were. These friends, they show up, and for 7 days, they don't say anything. They just sit with him in silence. And I think it is just the most beautiful picture that I've ever seen of what Paul writes in Romans 12:15, where he says, "Mourn with those who mourn." Because I got to be honest, sometimes as Christians, we get this wrong. We don't realize that Paul didn't write, "Fix those who mourn," or "Give advice to those who mourn," or "Tell those who are mourning they're Christians and therefore they should never mourn because they're supposed to be happy all the time." It's not what it says. It says mourn with those who mourn, that when someone is in a deep sadness, you can sit in a deep sadness with them. And sometimes that is the greatest comfort, that Job's friends don't get into trouble until they open their mouth and try to give a pat answer to what he's going through. So after 7 days, Job speaks, and it's not what you hope it will be. You'd think he spends this time, kind of shores up his faith, and then declares his faith in God again. But instead of blessing the name of the Lord, he begins cursing the day of his birth. See, this is why Job doesn't have a big TV ministry, because this isn't Tony Robbins positive thinking type of stuff that you see. Because literally for the next 28 chapters, Job pours out a level of bitterness and sorrow and doubt and anger toward God that is just literally staggering. Look at just a few examples of what we see Job say. "The arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks their poison. God's terrors are marshaled against me. God has wronged me and drawn his net around me." A lot of times when I hear people talk about Job, they always refer to the patient suffering of Job, the patience of Job. And when they say that, I almost kind of give them a weird look like, have you read the book of Job? Like, there are large portions of that story where patience is the last word I would use to describe Job. Because you see him demanding, like, "No, I need an answer now. Like, I need to know what's going on now." And he's like pointing his finger in the face of God saying, "This isn't right. This isn't how it's supposed to be. You need to let me know what's going on. Like, I want God to get down here and stand before me, and we're going to hash this out. We're going to talk this thing out, because this is not how things are supposed to be. I did not deserve what is going on right here." Patience is maybe not the best way to always describe Job. And so then it begins this big conversation between Job and his friends. And his friends, like I said, begin to give all these pat answers around why Job could possibly be going through what he's going through. And what they're doing is they're drawing from kind of the prevailing wisdom of the day. They're drawing from what in the ancient world was known as Mesopotamian wisdom literature. And we've talked about this a little bit before. I didn't call it that then, but in a gist, what is kind of at the heart of Mesopotamian wisdom literature is what's called the law of divine retribution. We've talked about this before. The law of divine retribution in a nutshell is this: if I'm blessed, it's because I'm good. If I'm suffering, it's because I've done something wrong. And so there's your pat answer. If something bad is happening to you, stop breaking the law. Stop acting like a moron. Stop whatever you're doing, and the blessing will come back. Like, it's a very two-dimensional, very simplistic way of viewing the world. And so Job spends 30 chapters droning on about this, in this kind of incredibly repetitive and incredibly boring kind of way. And I know what you're thinking. You're like, did the pastor just call the Bible boring? Yes, I did. Because it's meant to be like that. Like, the writer of Job actually does this on purpose. He's wanting to hit you over the head over and over and over to show you that Job was making a point. He was saying that he was claiming that he was not perfect. He's saying all this blessing that I had before, I did not earn it. Like, it didn't become, I didn't receive all of this blessing because somehow I'm this perfect person. And therefore, if I didn't earn my blessing, it stands to say that I didn't earn my suffering either. That in life, it's not that simple. And he's saying, I'm living proof of this idea that we don't necessarily earn, that it's not just based on our behavior. In Job 23, 3-4, then he says this. He says, if only I knew where to find him. He's talking about God. I mean, again, he's just saying, like, God, if you were here, if we were standing face to face, we'd get this figured out. He said, if only I could go to his dwelling, I would state my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. Now, it's funny how I feel like this is just a really interesting story with Job, because a lot of times when we talk about, it's like if someone is going through some sort of suffering, we say, well, you just need to trust God. You've heard people say that before. You just need to trust God. And truth be told, most of the time when we say you just need to trust God, that means you just need to passively sit there and do nothing and wait. But you see the way Job was, he was persistently pursuing God, demanding that this thing got figured out. And I sometimes wonder, and this is just me thinking out loud, I wonder sometimes if trusting God looks a little bit more like challenging God. That when we say to trust in God, that means I'm going to run as hard as I can after him, believing he's going to work in my best interest, instead of just saying, whatever happens, I'm just going to trust in God. I'm just going to believe whatever. It's just going to all work out. It's like, is that really the way trusting in God is supposed to be? So he says, man, I just wish I could get God to to bring him to court, and we can figure this thing out man to man. Well, little did he know he was about to get that answer. Job 38:1, it says this, then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. What do you think that was like? He's hanging out with this small group, they're debating theology, and suddenly these clouds roll in, and God, the God of the universe begins to speak. I can read what he says, but I feel like I need to have a Gandalf accent or something. Who is this that obscures my pain with words without knowledge? I can't maintain that the whole time, so you're just gonna have to imagine Gandalf, saying these words. He says, where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. I love this story because God is being sarcastic with Job, where he's like, hey, you were here at the beginning of the forming of the universe, weren't you? Oh, you weren't? Interesting. It's he's making a point to Job about the limited perspective of his viewpoint, his limited knowledge. He says, who stretched a measuring line across it? Or what were its footing set? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? Now, you'll notice if you read through the book, when God does appear, he doesn't seem to be giving the answers to Job's question of why. And this is important. I actually think this is deliberate, that God doesn't tell Job about the upper theater scenes of chapter 1 and 2. He doesn't tell him about the conversation of Satan, the accuser. He just asks Job a bunch of questions that Job can't answer. Now, I've always wondered, why does God do that? See, for a long time I read this book and I thought, God's just kind of mean. He's asking all these questions of someone who is clearly dumber than him, because we're all dumber than God. But again, the point is to point out that that Job has a finite mind, a limited point of view, and should not expect to understand everything. I was actually having a conversation with someone after the service. They said, how much can you apply that to your children even now? We tell our children to do things or we instruct them on certain things, and they ask why, and you realize, like, I could explain to you why I want you to do this, but you're just thinking about whether you get that piece of candy or not. If I were to explain to you the type of person I want you to become in 20 years, that is not on your radar. You would not understand that. And so then we say, because I told you so. Because I told you. Like, isn't that what parents say? Because we realize me explaining to my 3-year-olds the type of person I want them to become as an adult, that I want them to be able to delay gratification, to make wise choices, to eat in a way that they're not going to get diabetes when they're 45, not on their radar. Even if I did explain it to them, they wouldn't get it. So multiply that out infinitely to God. Is it a wonder that Jesus said that if you're going to inherit the kingdom, you have to become like little children? Where I realize, like, am I going to trust? Do I believe, even if I don't understand, that my parent has my best interest in mind? Now, part of what's happening here, I think this is really interesting, is these questions. There was an Old Testament scholar named Ellen Davis, where she points out that she believes that these questions that God is asking Job, that they're actually leading somewhere. Like, they're actually making a point. And I'll give you just a few examples so you can kind of begin to see where God is going with it. In Job 38:25, it says this. He asks these questions. He says, who cuts a channel for the torrents of rain and a path for the thunderstorm, to water a land where no one lives, an uninhabited desert, to satisfy a desolate wasteland and make it sprout with grass? Now, it's a really interesting question because, see, in ancient world in Israel, this would be a very striking image because life depended on rainfall. Like, you would never, ever waste water in the ancient world. So why would God water a land where no one lives? Why would he pour out rainfall on a desert where it's uninhabited? And so this Old Testament scholar is making the point, God is showing the reason why he does that is because he is just gratuitously good. Like, he's just good for no reason at all. He's good because he just loves to give, because it's just the nature of God in his foolishly loving heart to just give to everything in the world. Other examples he gives is he talks about how he delights in these animals that he's created that have no strategic importance or use whatsoever. Gives the example of an ostrich. He said the ostrich flaps its wings but cannot fly, plants its young, the eggs, in the sand, and then forgets where they are. Like, the ostrich is never going to be mother of the year. Like, even though your children are not in the room, I would suspect that all the mothers in the room at least have a vague idea where your children are right now. The ostrich, not so much. Never going to be mother of the year. And yet he says that he delights in the ostrich. And in verse 18 it says, Yet when she spreads her feathers to run, she laughs at horse and rider. He says, just this silly, useless creature, but I delight in her so much because I have a need for speed. Like, I just love how fast she can run. Like, I just delight in it simply because I created it. Another example, it talks about the behemoth, this animal that scholars debate on what the behemoth is, but in the ancient world, the behemoth was considered this chaos monster, this chaos creature that had to be destroyed, but not to God. God says that he ranks first among the works of God. He's kind of saying, best thing I ever did. The day I created the behemoth, I was on my A game. Like, that was some choice work. I'm really, really proud of that. Other ones, God delights in the wild ox that will never plow, never serve farmers. He delights in the wild donkey that will never be tamed. He delights in the mountain goat that gives birth in secret places that no human being will ever see. See, this whole section is God creating and caring for and giving to and delighting in animals that aren't good for any purpose that anybody can see. So why would God make a world like that? Author Annie Dillard put it like this. She said, it's because the Creator loves pizzazz. I love that. He revels in beauty. He revels in goodness of the least strategic of his creatures. And it's because there is this God who is over it all. And when you see what this God is like, the way he acts in the world, we see that this God at his very core is gratuitously good, uncontrollably generous, and irrationally loving. That is who he is. He gives for no reason at all. It is simply his nature. He can't help himself. God loves pizzazz. Now, Job never does find out about this conversation between God and Satan, and I think he doesn't find out for a reason. And it's not because God doesn't care, and it's not because God doesn't want him to know. It's not, because, whatever. I think the reason why is God doesn't let him know is because Job's story is our story. In this life, on this not okay earth, you live and I live and we live here on the lower stage, and we don't get to know. We don't always get to see. We don't always get to understand. But in the midst of all this not knowing, Job does find out something that is much better. He finds out who God is. Irrationally loving, gratuitously good, and unbelievably self-giving. And at the end of the day, that was enough. This is why in Job 42:5 he says, "My ears have heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." And that's enough. The goodness of God and the reality of his presence are enough. And see, this is the great kind of scandal of the book of Job, is that Job asked for answers and God gave his presence instead. And see, I believe what I just said, that's a true word. I don't pretend that it's a final word, but I believe it's a true word. And see, here's the main point that I want to make with this. The question of pain and suffering is first and foremost a question of trust in God. Will I trust him even if I don't understand? Can I keep moving forward even if I don't have all the answers? Because what can happen is, with questions like this, we can find ourselves arriving in kind of two different camps. And I'm trying to even remember who coined these two terms, but I feel like it's a great way to talk about it. That I heard someone talk about it once, that you can have honest doubt and dishonest doubt. Honest doubt is where it's like, I just don't know, and I just want clarity. I just want to know why that thing is the way it is, or why that thing happened the way that it is. I just genuinely want to know, but even if I'm not able to find out, I can still move forward, even without a final word. But someone in a place of dishonest doubt, at the very core of who they are is this skepticism, this cynicism that is already bent toward unbelief. And so usually the way someone who is operating in dishonest doubt will be is they say, if you can't give me a final word on this subject, unless you can give me an airtight argument that leaves no question for doubts or lingering questions or anything like that, I'm out. I'm not going to believe. I'm going to reject the entire thing unless you can answer all of my questions perfectly without any questions remaining. But the truth is, people who live in that place, they never find it. They never find that kind of final word, because it's only in a place of trust do we begin to understand and see God for not only what he does, but who he is. Now, the book of Job, it ends in a very significant way, a very interesting way. I was a little confused by the way Job ended until I began to see it kind of through this lens. This is how this little epilogue happens. Job 42:12. It says, "The Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the former part. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys, and he also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. First daughter he named Jemimah, and the second Keziah, and the third Karen-Hapuk. Nowhere in all the land were there found women as beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father granted them an inheritance along with their brothers." Now, this seems kind of strange because when we read it, it's easy for a lot of this stuff to just kind of sail past and we don't really feel like we miss anything. But for an ancient reader who lived in that time and culture to see the way that story ends, there's certain things that are said that beg a question, beg a response, that kind of create some well, no, wait, now why is that the way that it is? And I'll give you a couple examples. For one, when it lists off the genealogy of Job's children, because it said he had 7 sons, 3 daughters, none of the sons' names are given. And in Hebrew numerology, the sons are the names through which family lineage is reckoned. So none of the sons' names are mentioned, but the daughters' names are given. And their names are really weird. Now, of course, if if you don't know Hebrew, it doesn't, you wouldn't notice it, but like the meanings of their names are almost kind of silly. Because see, in Hebrew culture, Hebrew names are very serious. They express character. They express virtue. They're used to express some sort of really important kind of theological truth about who God is or what he's got going on. But their three names, they're just about beauty. They're almost like silly type names. Like Jemima. Like we all know Jemima means pancake syrup, right? No, I'm joking. It means dove. It's referring to this kind of just this, extraordinarily beautiful, lovely bird. Keziah, the second daughter, is the Hebrew word for cinnamon. It was kind of a prized spice back then. I love cinnamon. Anybody like Cinnabon? Have you been to Cinnabon before? Like you just walk by a Cinnabon and you like smell it. I feel like Cinnabon's like one of the great proofs of the existence of God in the world. And so I'm thinking, okay, his first kid's name pancake syrup. The second one is Cinnabon. Like, did he name his kids before breakfast? Like, where did these names come from? I don't know. But then the last one, Karen Hapuk, it actually means horn of shadow. Like it's referring to makeup. So like literally this would be the equivalent of Job naming his daughter Revlon or Maybelline. Like, it's just this silly name that doesn't make any sense at all. But on top of that, it also says he gives them an inheritance. Now, this is where it would get really weird because, see, in the ancient world, your inheritance was kind of like your security for retirement, almost kind of like what your 401k would be today. You give your inheritance to your sons because you know one day they will care for you. They will take care of you in your old age. And so it was not a financially strategic thing to give money, to give inheritance to your daughters, because that just went to the in-laws side of the family. It was basically wasting money. So, I mean, even back then, giving money to your daughters was a waste of money. Who knew? So if you had 7 sons like Job did, you would not give any money to your daughters because they would have to go to all of your sons. So the sons were financially strategic, the daughters would not. So why does the writer include it? What point is being made about Job in giving this little detail? Well, John Ortberg was talking about this idea. He believed that this was included because in the end, we see that after everything that Job went through and had to endure, we now see that he has become the type of person who delights in and gives to the least strategic of his creatures. We see that Job, like God, has become gratuitously good, uncontrollably generous, and irrationally loving. That he has begun to give for no reason at all, even knowing that it will never benefit him. He has become, in a lot of ways, the wonderful Wizard of Oz. Did you not see I was going there with that? Come on, guys. Now, when you think about Job, does he remind you of anybody else? Like when you think about Job, does he remind you of somebody who would come centuries and centuries later, someone who would talk about God in a way that would sound an awful lot like God was talked about in the book of Job? He would say things like, "Consider the lilies of the field. They neither toil nor spin, and yet Solomon in all of his grandeur and all of his beauty and all of his riches is not as beautiful as they of these flowers, these plants that are here for a day and then gone tomorrow." Why should the lilies of the field be so beautiful? Because there is a God who is gratuitously good, outrageously generous, and irrationally loving, and we live in his world, and he loves them. And so he just gives without limits, and we live in that world. This man who looked a lot like Job, that we would later know as Jesus of Nazareth, would live like Job east of Eden, in a not okay world in the land of Uz, and he would suffer terrible things, although he was without sin. Suffer to the point that he would be nailed to a cross, and we would see on that cross a display of the God of the universe, this God that we thought was so great could never possibly be displayed in such a way, and we would learn through that cross that God was indeed, in fact, gratuitously good, outrageously generous, and irrationally loving for all of us to see. And so, at the end of the day, Satan got it wrong about Job. See, we think, again, that the central question of Job is, where is God in the midst of suffering? But the central question among the book of Job is, could a human being hold on to God, faith, love, and goodness when it does not seem to pay off at all? And the truth is, one could, and one did. Now, Job couldn't see the upper stage. He didn't know that his faithfulness had meaning beyond his wildest dreams. He didn't know something cosmic and eternal and vast was at stake in his little life as he sat in an ash heap, scraping boils off his skin with broken pottery. He had no idea that his faithfulness and suffering was being used to literally vindicate God's whole wild adventure of covenant love. And because of that, his honesty and perseverance have now for thousands of years inspired millions of people who live in the land of Uz to hear this core message to hang on, don't let go, don't give up. You have no idea. God is so close. God is so good. And the writer wants to not just say it to Job, he wants to say it to us. And he wants us to say it to each other. And he wants us to hear it for ourselves, because the truth is, we live in the land of Uz. We live in the land of anxiety and death and fear and failure and relational breakdown and confusion and hurt. We all do. Why? I don't know. How long will it last? I don't know. Does your response matter? More than you could possibly imagine. Let's pray. Father, I thank you, God, that you have shown us, not just in the book of Job, but even in the suffering of your Son, that clinging to you in trust, even in the midst of suffering, even in the midst of pain, even when we don't have all of the answers, matters. That this lie that we're told by the enemy that we have to have all of the answers before we move forward is just untrue. That at the core of this covenant love walk is trust. Will we trust you? Will we walk forward with you even if we don't have all the answers, even if we don't see the entire picture? Because the truth is we never will. If we spend our entire lives waiting for the final word, we will never see it. And we'll discard every true word that comes along the way to help us on the journey. So God, help us to live in ruthless trust with you, not to just passively sit there and just let whatever happen, but that we would move forward, that we would challenge things, we would persistently pursue you, God, to do what we know only you can do, because we know that you have our best interest at heart. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. I want to invite